I would like to welcome everybody and bring a little toast for Bildung and for our network and for everybody to have a nice and cozy Thursday evening where we discuss this incredibly important topic about what kind of building do we need in order to save the planet. But first, cheers and welcome to the Fireside Chat.
Cheers.
So with us tonight are three very special guests, and I would like them to stay on camera and stay on their microphone, and for everybody else to turn off their mic and their camera. I would like to welcome Sandrine Dixson-Decleve, who is the co-president of the Club of Rome, and Mina Salami, who is a blogger, Miss Afropolitan, and Professor Klaus van Egmond. And I would like you to just briefly introduce yourselves, what it is you're doing and where you are, because I mean, we got people from all over Europe here, and I know that we're the sort of in the northern western corner now, but we are in 4 different places. So Sandrine, please.
Thank you, Lena. I'm currently south of Brussels, so in Belgium, watching very closely what's happening right now in the European Commission, because we have some real issues on our hands. 2 big issues. One is our agricultural policy is going totally pear-shaped and not taking into consideration the fact that we're in the midst of a planetary emergency. And big farming interests are definitely lobbying to make sure that we don't go where we should be going. And the other is our EU recovery plan, which also is going pear-shaped and we had hoped would be a green and social recovery, and now seems to be hijacked by incumbents. So you can kind of get an idea of what I work in. But I have several hats. I am the president of the Club of Rome, but I also am an advisor to the European Commission, also chairing a think tank on the economic and societal impacts of innovation and research, and sit on many different advisory boards and work also in the area of sustainable finance. And so I'm really looking forward to this conversation, in particular around the role of communities and Bildung in ensuring that we really strengthen people's sense of identity in the need to fight the convergence of these tipping points, which is climate, biodiversity loss, and the health pandemic at the same time. And I look forward to the conversation that we're going to have.
Wonderful, thank you. Mina, a few words about yourself, please.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm really looking forward to this conversation as well. So I also wear many hats, but I guess what connects all of the things that I do is my role as a public intellectual. So whether I'm writing books or essays or op-eds or blog posts, or whether I'm speaking and lecturing, I'm always interested in the dissemination and the creation of ideas and knowledge. And the kinds of topics that I tend to look at are to do with, first and foremost, with feminism, but also with identity and African studies, cultural studies. And I write a lot about what you might call multi-perspectivalism. I'm Finnish, Swedish, and Nigerian by background. And so I have my foot in many worlds, but at the moment I'm in London. And before lockdown, I was splitting my time between Lagos and London, but I'm now kind of stuck here, which is not altogether a bad thing. I mean, London's not a bad place to be stuck in. And also, since I used to travel so much for work, it's been somewhat refreshing and good for ideas production anyway, to stay put in one place. So all of these things will surely inform the conversation tonight.
Right, and one more thing, because I mean, this is the Bildung Network, and I know that you grew up not speaking neither Finnish nor English in your home and in your childhood, but you were actually raised in.
No, actually what it is, I grew up speaking English and Finnish, but also my parents, who met in Germany, spoke German to each other and to me. So we had like a trilingual household, you could say.
So I mean, you really have your roots in the European languages in all corners of the continent and the African continent, and that's one of the reasons why we invited you. So so welcome and thank you for joining. And Klaas, a bit about you and your work, please.
Yeah, my name is Klaas van Egmond. Welcome to everybody as well. I'm in a small village near Utrecht, and in Utrecht we have Utrecht University, where I'm still working as a retired professor on sustainability and environmental sciences. I started my career in 1972 when the Club of Rome had its first report, Limits to Growth, and we are over the years still in contact with Dennis Meadows, who was on the team in those days. Over the years, I worked in the National Health and Environmental Institute, later as a director, and I studied there all these things like climate change and circular economy and what have you. The later the decades, I've been working on a different subject, a little bit shifted into the direction of value orientations, given the fact that all these nice policies we are just having on the table, all these scenario studies, for example, didn't work out at all. When you are not changing the mindset of policymakers, you're not changing anything. So we started to do the work on world views, value orientations, etc. And a third activity nowadays from my side, which is taking much of my time, apart from my still ongoing work on the university, is referring to what Sandrine already mentioned, the sustainable finance. Almost 10 years ago, a colleague and me selected the Sustainable Finance Laboratory here in our university. And we are working now with about 15 economists. I'm the only non-economist on the team on this sustainable finance. So I'm back in making models to simulate the real economy and the financial economy. And we have the opinion, but that will be an issue for later discussion, of course, that the financial system at this moment is the back problem, the driver for unsustainability in our current society.
Thank you very much. And I mean, you write a number of books, and you write about the importance of culture with relation to all the natural science that we need to understand. So yes, so welcome to you as well. So my first question to all three of you, and I don't know who wants to speak first, is what do you see are the biggest challenges that we're facing? You've already sort of mentioned it, but what I mean, if you should pick, you know, the most crucial ones, the biggest ones, what would that be?
I can start, I guess, if you want. Clearly, I think that there's a convergence of tipping points that are making our existence on this planet the greatest existential risk to our lives. And I would probably link it to, I've been rereading the Laudato Si that was published actually by Pope Francis, because I'm speaking at the Vatican next week. And I really liked the way in which Pope Francis put forward the fact that it's really egos that have totally taken over, whether it be religious thinking or actually the way in which we move within our lives, leadership scenarios, models of change. Everything is linked around the individual. And he talks about Anthropocentrism. And we know that this is the era of the Anthropocene. So this is the area of humankind. But the problem is humankind is so friggin' self-centered that it has forgotten that actually we need to move from the ego to the eco, into ecocentrism. And that is what we talk about at the Club of Rome, as you know, Lena, that we very much also need to really shift away from this destruction of the planetary boundaries, which for me is one of the biggest issues we're confronted with, is the fact that actually the convergence of the climate, the biodiversity crises with now the health pandemic makes it the greatest existential risk to ourselves. So that would be the first thing. But then you put on top of that, again, this ego mentality of the lack of enlightened leadership and the lack of eco leadership, but actually self-centered leadership, which propagates hate that we see coming from Trumpism or coming from Bolsonaro or coming from Erdogan, or so many of our leaders who have forgotten what real leadership looks like. And that also just compounds the existing crisis that we need, because in order to solve the crises that we have before us, we actually need to have collective and solidarity thinking. And instead, they're propagating individualism, which is going completely against the way in which we can build resilience within our societies. So I would say that we're confronted right now with some really clear existential risks in terms of the fact that the planet is actually collapsing around us. but so is humanity collapsing in terms of the propagation of hate, the way in which we cannot accept different cultures. Look at what's just happened again in France. The fact that actually people can think that cutting off people's heads is the right way to react to not actually feeling or thinking in the same way, rather than trying to unpack complexity and look at the tensions in society by working together and trying to exchange knowledge, to understand knowledge, and then to translate that into action so that we actually shift the way in which we live our lives. So I would just put forward that landscape is the way I'm looking at things for the moment.
Right. Thank you. And I forgot to mention one thing, and that is that all our guests here in the Zoom room, you're most welcome to go to the chat and write questions and comments. And we have Esley, who will follow the chat and bring out some of the questions later. But for now, so Mina, I will let you tell us what are the biggest challenges we're facing, according to your opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the biggest concrete challenges that we are facing are the things that we hear about a lot. So environmental collapse. We have big issues with poverty, famine, war, and the refugee crises that those create. There's gender, class, and racial inequality that are big issues to tackle. And then, of course, also more on the fringes, there's different types of populisms, whether it's kind of fundamentalism in whichever political leaning. And so these are all the kinds of concrete issues that we face. But I think that they're ultimately tied to what really is the problem and what I would call a crisis in relationship. So the way we don't have healthy relationships with ourselves, with each other, and with our planet. And this kind of manifests in all levels of society. So even where we could say we don't have healthy relationships between politicians and citizens, between educators and those who are receiving the education. In our personal lives, we see many issues in how the relationships between parents and children, or between partners in the same household. And this crisis of relationship is in return, and this, I guess I would say, is the main problem that we face, because the crisis of relationship is created by the wrong type of knowledge feeding our consciousness. So we have a type of knowledge production, and we are educated and indoctrinated in ways that create fragmentation and division. And so we're unable to have healthy relationships. And instead, we're divided across all the spheres of society. And so long as we are that, we cannot solve the more concrete issues, such as environmental collapse and gender inequality and things like that.
And when you talk about a crisis of relationships, I'm thinking, is this also a crisis of relationship, not just among us as people, but also with nature and with, the larger society, and not just...
Yes, absolutely. The crisis of relationship, this is the thing about it, because it emanates from a certain type of knowledge production. It ripples into every segment of society, from our most intimate relationships. And even, as I said, the relationship we have with ourselves is quite often unhealthy, to the relationship we have with our home, Mother Earth. And, until we kind of start to look at those questions and have leadership that addresses those questions. I love what Sandrine said, and her referring to the Pope and this, and also eco before ego. Like it's very related to that, because that has to do with our relationship with the planet.
Klaus?
Yeah, I fully agree with the earlier speakers on the subject, all these problems we are facing at this very moment. But my view is that we can understand all these problems from the fact that we have lost a moral framework at this moment. In terms of relationships, that's the case, of course. In terms of this very anthropocentric versus ecocentric thinking, My view is that we have lost this ethical framework. Many philosophers in these days, for example, McIntyre is stating that that framework on morality is lost, and that is the consequence. You might say it also in terms of Emmanuel Macron these days, who is saying that we need a new orientation on what we are defining as progress. Last year in March, he sent us Europeans a letter in which he was discussing this issue. What is our understanding of progress nowadays? He is saying we have no idea of good and bad developments, and I think that is a problem. And the reason for that is that we have over the centuries the mechanism in which our human condition, our view on our human condition and our human nature, how we value that human condition, is changing in a structural sense. For example, in the Middle Ages, we were overemphasizing these religious things. And nowadays, the discussion in France today is the overemphasization of, in this case, then Islam. We used to do it in Europe in the same way in Christianity. The overemphasis on the religious truth. So there is one truth, and if you don't have that truth, you have a problem. And then the non-believers have to be killed, is the idea. The idea that there is one single truth which can be known, and some people have it. On the other hand, we have in our days an overemphasis of the material aspect of our human condition. That's actually exactly the same as the overemphasis of the religious part. It's just the other way around. And the effects are more or less the same. It ends in catastrophe. So certain values, in our case, the materialist is overemphasized. It becomes an obsession, and we think that we can become happy by having more materialist orientation. So the car has to be bigger, and the air travel journey has to be further over the globe. And that doesn't work out. So that's the way why we have organized our ecological crisis. What is behind all this ethical thinking, the problem? It's the idea, and already Mina mentioned it, it's a lack of consciousness. We are not aware of the fact how this works in our human beings. And I think that we have to rediscover European culture, given the fact that in European culture, if you take myths, legends, fairy tales, the great works of Shakespeare, Mozart, etc., they all contain the solution for this problem. And it's to maintain a balance. Everything in the cosmos is in dynamic equilibrium, and we have to just rediscover that mechanism of an equilibrium in our value orientations. And when we are able to maintain that, and I think I'm a supporter of Macron, as you have learned, that people with this view and leadership can lead us the way how we, based on our European culture, which is our treasure, that we can find a way back into a civilized society again.
So what I hear from Sandrine is very much about tipping points, and I mean, you brought in the environment. Mina, you mentioned the relationships, and Klaas, you basically talked about a moral framing that is either too materialistic or too religious, but we're lacking the balance. So what kind of knowledge do we have? What kind of science? Where should we turn in order to address these things? Who knows the stuff that we need to know?
It's really interesting you should ask that point, because I think that I'm not sure we need more science. I actually really don't think we need more science. I think we need a different type of knowledge. So we need the science to understand the type of policy mechanisms and market shifts, financial shifts and economic shifts that we need to make in society to really create that new type of more equitable living, both equitable in terms of other people and equitable in terms of our planet that we can survive. The science to do that, we have. The problem is the political will and the human will to really shift into ensuring that actually we become much more ecocentric rather than egocentric. And Mina is so right. I mean, part of this is the relationships that we have with ourselves. I mean, I'll never forget, one of the first jobs I ever had was putting in place an environmental management system in a nuclear facility. And when I arrived, I had all my slides, and I was a young woman engineer. And I had gone in to think about, how do I teach and work with these young managers around how they put in place an environmental management system. But the problem is that there was a total dysfunctionality between the management and the way in which all different sides of the management were working together. There was no respect for each other. There was no human respect at all. There was a real hierarchical system. And after the first few weeks, I realized I wasn't going to teach them anything around environmental management because actually they didn't respect each other. And so that comes back to Mina's point. If you don't have any deep respect or understanding of other people's perspectives, you won't get anywhere. It doesn't matter how right you are. And that has been the confrontation that the Club of Rome has had and many other environmentalists in terms of how do we make people understand that actually we must live within the planetary boundaries, that Mother Earth is our salvation, that we are not our salvation. This is the biggest problem, is our ego has always determined the way in which we function within Mother Earth, as if we are better than every other species. We are a minutia within the universe. And until we understand that, and until we start to put in place this level of respect and this morality that Klaus very much clearly refers to, which is not religious, it's a question of respect. Respect for all species, respect for the planetary boundaries, respect for ourselves. And that's where the teaching needs to come in, because the science, we have it, but the continuation, the propagation of power and arrogance, and now ignorance, because the biggest thing that is actually creating the demise of this society and human species is the arrogance with the ignorance. All of a sudden, it's okay to be stupid. We've dumbed down knowledge. And that is what we're seeing in the United States, not only with the president of the United States, with half of the population who think that it's cool actually to go against science, to go against knowledge, to go against what experts are saying. That's cool. That we have to absolutely shift if we want to make any change in society.
Mina, Klaus?
I could not agree more with what you just said. I mean, and going back to a crisis in relationship, you know, that if there's one thing that science cannot solve, it is a crisis of relationship. It can solve many things technically, health-wise, all of those kinds of things. And it can give us very important research and statistics and findings, indeed, but it cannot help us solve the crisis of relationship. If anything, the thinking that science can solve all of our problems exacerbates this crisis in relating to one another and to our planet, because something that really deeply lies at the core of this problem is that this kind of mono solutions to problems. And what I have a book titled Sentience Knowledge, which is very much about integrating different types of knowledge, so both science and art and things like that. And the very at the very crux of this is that there's one type of knowledge, which is the conventional type, and the one that most of us in Europe are exposed to. And we do believe very widely that science is the solution of our problems. But across the world, we have, you know, similar kinds of ideas. So for some people, religion is the panacea and the solution of all problems. And then you have people who argue that, oh, art and creativity is the solution to everything. Whatever it is, this fragmented way of thinking where we believe that just one thing will solve our problems is what ultimately creates more division. And the more division we have, the less we can start to relate to each other healthily and have dialogue and have those incredibly crucial conversations that we have to have right now if we're going to save our planet, to restore it in any kind of way. So I'm really mindful and concerned whenever I see propagated the idea that science should be the solution, which is not at all to say that science isn't a very important part of it, because it gives us knowledge that we need, and it helps us to think rationally, which we have to do. But I strongly believe in the kind of interweaving of our inner worlds and the outward lives that we live, and so it's yeah, that's the biggest challenge for me.
Klaus, I guess that is the story of your life, isn't it? I mean, you started in geoscience, and now you're writing about culture. I mean, what was it that made you expand your field of study or exploration? I mean, where did you realize that you needed to shift the focus?
Yeah, well, actually, the way of thinking of Sandrine and Minna in its consequence over the decades made me to shift in that direction. For they are completely right. We cannot solve this problem in the way we were functioning. We were making all these very nice reports and huge computations, huge models, and it didn't work out. Well, I think that the words like rationality, etc., are just given by money. But the idea is that during the Enlightenment period over the last few hundred years, we had an overemphasis in my feeling, in from my perspective, an overemphasis of the universal truths combined with materialist thinking. And then you get rationality and this whole idea of enlightenment in which we have this science and technology, and that mindset is then dominating the scene. And what we are seeing now, and until the present day, that in this mindset people want to solve the problem by technology. That is the way of thinking of the last few hundred years. We have a comedian here in the Netherlands, and Freek de Jonge, not known to you most likely, but he was saying someday in one of these sketches that the problem with the world is that everybody zooms in and nobody zooms out. And that was also for me a big trigger for the idea that in our universities we are training students to zoom in on more and more. All these PhDs in which I'm also involved till present day, they are knowing more of less, and that doesn't bring forward the big picture. So they don't. If you are working that way, you don't see the problem of the whole. So zooming out and seeing the whole picture, and then that brings also the statement of Mina that there isn't. They think that panacea is technology. Others think the panacea is religion or something like that. Still others thinking that the free market is the solution. Others are thinking that the small scale solar panels on my roof is a solution. And the answer is that it must be done. In all the scenarios we have made over my lifetime, always the same story came about. And when you're talking about climate change, we have, of course, this enormous development in CO2 emission. Then we have the 1.5 or 2 degrees world in which we have to reduce these emissions substantially. And that should be done in all these scenarios by technology for 50% more or less, and also by changing behavior. But nobody in this country, at least, I think in Europe as well, is discussing changing behavior, for we are all disciples of the Enlightenment period, and we are going to solve this problem with technology. We are going to, our minister here is saying that we are going to use electric airplanes. And that mindset is the problem. So I want to make a plea for a university in which we have all these things together. The work of the Club of Rome, Dennis Meadows, was a first attempt to try to zoom out and look at the whole picture. And that we did in our institute over all these years. But I think the solution is there. And then finally, we can train people to zoom in and zoom out. That as an ability you both have to achieve. And then you are going into the direction of Bildung, I think. Bildung, for me, last sentence, is education in civilization. And civilization is keeping balance of all our human faculties. And if we learn, people, policymakers, scientists, that keeping balance, we will have a next step, not only in science or education, but in our civilization as well. For me,
so how many of your colleagues in the university can you talk to about this? I mean, are you alone or are there others?
There are others, about 10%, and our group is growing, of course. But it is a good question. It's a whole debate. We are over every 5 years we are discussing this with the board of the university, and then we are saying, look at Stockholm University and Johannes Rökstroom, the boundaries. I know him. There they have a group who is studying all together in the university, a faculty which is not on geosciences like mine or on something else, chemistry, but it's the science of the whole. In our institute here in the Netherlands, National Institute, and the assessment agency where I worked, we have also made, against the ideas of many of these people, a group who is studying the whole. And then you have other types of science. You are studying these cultural things. You are studying integrative models, interactions, dynamical behavior of the planet. And then you get a complete different orientation. And then you finally can say something about the interaction between climate change, biodiversity, energy, economy, population growth, cultural settings, perspectives, etc. And then you can hope to bring across the awareness that we should act on the whole picture and not only come every now and then of time and again with the solution of technology alone.
But so, I mean, the university, I mean, originally that was, thinking of the whole, that was bringing everything together.
Yeah.
So is that, where did we go wrong?
I think in this Enlightenment period, the idea that the idea was that the world is something like a machinery, and all these wheels and what have you in their conveyor belts in that machinery called Earth, we have to study. And the more we know of all these details, the better you understand the total structure. But the complete view on the world as being a machine is a wrong worldview. For in our descending in the secularization, which we saw from the Middle Ages, in which this overemphasis on religious, spiritual things was dominating, people said, "Okay, forget about this. We have learned. We had a terrible time with the church. Now we are replacing the truth of the church by the truth of science." Many of the university buildings, at least mine in Utrecht, we are having our university main quarters in the former palace of the Bishop of Utrecht. So we just took over the church there, and now we had the one truth of science instead of the one truth of the church, and nothing changed. So in the secularization, we wanted to say goodbye to spiritual, religious things, and then we made everything materialist. And that was the reason that we were thinking that the world was a material thing, rather than being material and non-material qualities. And the whole idea about spiritual thinking, about the idea that there are non-material values, there is culture in a sense. There is the whole idea of Schiller that beauty is just the projection of the spiritual world into the physical matter. Art is doing that. Painters are doing that. Music is doing that. And that was denied. That was a hobby for fireside chats, but not for real science at the university. And that what the reason for that was the secularization. So we have now overemphasized that material qualities, and time is now to rebalance that again and say, okay, we have to balance these qualities with the balance between the individual and the collective, between me and the others, and the balance between material, physical things, my body, and my, say, spirit.
Mina, I know you write about this in your latest book. Can you tell us a bit about it, please?
Yeah, of course. Okay, so my book is titled Sentience Knowledge, and what sentience knowledge is in a nutshell is the interweaving of emotional intelligence, science and art, academic study with storytelling. So basically the interweaving of these fragmented parts of our lives, and also very much so, as Klaas was just saying, the interweaving between the material and the non-material. So in my book, I sort of contrast sentience knowledge to what I refer to as Euro-patriarchal knowledge, which is not synonymous with white men, but with a form of knowledge production which emphasizes and glorifies what I would define as a rigid and a robotic and machine-like type of knowledge production, which really seeks to sort of promote this idea that technical know-how and science are the solutions to all of our problems. And yes, so the heart of this issue, this interweaving, is to create this synthesis, or this whole, as Klaas mentioned, so that we in order for individuals and the collective to come to a realization that we are codependent and that we exist in an ecosystem together, and we can only do that once again by identifying that we have this crisis in our relationships. And so sensuous knowledge is, as the word sensuous is actually quite different in the English language to the word sensual, which has to do with the senses and pleasure.
Please like, elaborate a bit on that, because I really find the word sensuous interesting. I mean, it's an aspect of human life that we're not used to talking about. I mean, sensuality, you can look that up in any, lifestyle magazine or on the sluttier side of the internet, but this is something completely different.
Yeah, it is quite different. So sensuousness was, the word sensuous was coined by the poet John Milton. And he coined this term because he was looking for something a word that would describe poetry. And he wasn't satisfied with sensual because, as you allude to, that is related to sexuality to too far of an extent. And so he coined sensuous to connote a feeling that connects the mind, body, and soul. And he argued that poetry does that, which is a true argument. And so when I speak of sensuous knowledge, I'm speaking of the type of knowledge production that you could say integrates mind, body, and soul. And therefore, I'm neither saying that we should, because quite often people interpret that as saying, oh, we should focus on the arts and emotions and spirituality. And I'm not quite advocating that. I'm saying we need both. We've always historically wanted to really rigidly stick to whichever one of the two. So we are either focusing on the emotions or on rational thinking. And I'm arguing that we need the two to create a flourishing society.
Balance, relationship.
Exactly. So the balance there is important. Also, I think, it's quite interesting when we speak of the material, and obviously the way that class was speaking about the material is in a sense of meaning like res extensa, so things that exist separate to us. But it also made me think about the material as it is connected to capital, and your question of why universities are failing at demonstrating the whole and the balance that we so desperately need. And I think, it's very much connected to the kind of hyper-capitalist and consumerist societies that we've created actually through Enlightenment thinking, or what I refer to as Euro-patriarchal knowledge, in which, our universities have become vested with interest. So the knowledge production that they produce, it lies in the interest of departments to create fragmenting, narrow knowledge production. I'm generalizing very broadly here, but the infiltration of capital interest into our universities, as well as into what we might define as spiritual practice, in all fields of life. And then, of course, above everything, when it comes to the exploitation of nature and the idea of nature as something material that we can exploit for profit-making endeavors. I think this is a really central question that also brings us back to why relationship is something that is so undermined in our conventional education. Because once we start to focus on relationship across the board on all levels, it kind of automatically counters a really hyper-capitalist worldview. Because when we're producing goods, when we're producing institutions and corporations, whatever it is, and the incentive is to produce a continued exploitative profit, then there is no room for building sustainable relationships, because that just comes in the way of that. And so the focus on building more sustainable relationships among ourselves and with the natural world, in some ways directly challenges the ideas that have laid the foundation for our consumerist societies and our knowledge production.
There's a word that pops into my mind right now, which is competition. I mean, the marketplace is a place of competition, but also the university is a place of competition. I mean, it's an extremely competitive environment. And Klaus, I mean,
Can I come in here,
yeah,
Lynn?
absolutely.
Yeah, because I really have several things that I want to build on, coming both from Klaus and from Mina. The first is around the behavioral change. I mean, I think that the biggest calamity of most of us who've wanted to tap into how we can actually shift behavior is not understanding what makes people tick. It's actually forcing the thinking that everyone is tied to the same things that many of us, for example, environmentalists or social activists, were tied to, without thinking that actually others may not have that same functionality. And it's the same issue with the North-South debate. It's the same issue with the gender debate, with the racial debate, etc. And again, that comes back to not getting under people's skin and understanding what makes them tick, what is important to them, which is, again, this egocentric attitude that I was speaking about. And you can translate that through academia. So the discussions that I've had, because I also teach at Cambridge University, and also now through this research and innovation think tank that I lead on the economic and societal impacts of research and innovation, I mean, the total disconnect between the way in which academia has continued to thrive. Much of it, of course, yes, absolutely, is capital centric, which is what Mina has brought up. And I fully agree. The fact that there has been this competition of trying to continue to get the funding for the university, to get funding for one's own pet project, rather than thinking about the societal needs. I mean, we have to realize that there is still very much in research and innovation a disconnect between really what society needs and impact and what people think society needs, or their own research that they're promoting. So that's one element. So academia has become totally disenfranchised from putting in place a system that actually will bring forward the thought leadership necessary to create the paradigm shift that society needs to meet actually the resilience that we need to build against the crises that are facing us. There is no real look at the complexity and the unpacking of the tensions between people, planet, and prosperity, for example. There is no real systemic overview in the way in which departments are working together, exactly as Klaus has indicated, because there's been a history of siloed mentality, but also there's been a history of egos. A prof thinks that he has the clear idea of a theory of change, and obviously, sorry, I've just said he, but often that is the case. And he just keeps on going. But I think even worse now is the discussions I have with youth. I mean, we had, as you know, Lena, at the Club of Rome, 500 young people, and you actually spoke at the Youth Summit. And what did we hear from these young people? University dropouts. The number of people that no longer believe that university is going to give them the tools that they need to deal with complexity. Those people who feel that actually, even though they believe in knowledge, that they don't want to be taught to, they want to understand, they want to rebuild, they want to co-create, they want to create within a collaborative and a different type of mechanism. And the university structure is not enabling that anymore.
It's really strange, because I mean, the universities, I mean, we can go back to Plato's Academy. I mean, it used to be a place for dialogue. And even the modern tradition.
Universities are that way, right, Lena? I mean, clearly there are some universities that are trying to do the right thing, but the way in which now we're talking to young people, we're realizing that actually they don't feel that this is the knowledge base anymore. And not only the knowledge base, it may be the theory, but it's disconnected with the action that's necessary, and the anxiety and the fears that many of these young engineers or others have in terms of how can they actually be part of creating a new future for themselves.
So what kind of education is it that we should create with them, not for them, with them? What is it the world is lacking? What should be out there?
So I think part of it is very much unpacking these tensions, understanding the complexities, putting in place systems thinking, trying to have multidisciplinary master's programs or multidisciplinary bachelor's programs, putting in place frameworks within the university that enable students to be multidisciplinary, enabling them also to have the tools, many of which needs to be much more hands-on than just theory. But that said, I mean, there's a question here around new knowledge and warm data, etc. I mean, I also think we do need to bring in old knowledge. In my conversations with the new generation, you know, what strikes me the most is they keep on thinking that none of us went out in the streets like they're doing now. I mean, I was in the anti-apartheid movement. I also was out in the street. And they also don't think that anything happened on the environment over the last 40 years. They don't get that actually there have been struggles. There were just different types of prioritization. So we need to get better at passing on that knowledge and then listening to the new knowledge and then using different types of integrated processes, whether it's deep demonstrations, for example, in city environments or community environments, where you can start to bring in warm data and you can also demonstrate what's really happening between different types of actors, or whether it be the way in which we bring in night education, different types of educational classes, as Bildung also very much propagates, or knowledge and storytelling between communities, as well as academia and universities. So we need to bring back, exactly as Plato and Socrates and so many others felt, that knowledge is about speaking to each other, sharing, and bringing forward ideas. But then, as you know, my pet peeve is, let's not just stay in the ideas and the theory, then let's translate some of that into action, because we don't have a hell of a lot of time to deal with these crises at hand.
Mina, is there an African perspective on this?
Oh, I mean, Africa is such a big continent with so many different types of philosophies.
I know, but I mean, we're talking very much from a European, you know, university angle here, and I mean, we've touched upon poetry and culture and the arts and spirituality and I mean, we are in Europe. But there is also, I mean, there's the rest of the world as well. So, and you're right about that.
It's a great question, though, and I'm really glad that you ask it so that we can bring in some other kind of perspectives. And I mean, interestingly, if I'm not completely mistaken, the first university actually was in Africa, in ancient Egypt, and I think from there was transported to ancient Greece, and we have a, you know, at the core of these ideas was the university as a place to not only learn facts and figures, but to learn self-knowledge. And really, I think that is the thing that a lot of young people, even if they are not able to articulate it, are craving and are aware that, you know, the problem here is that I don't want to go to university because it's not going to teach me about myself and my relationships with others, which I keep returning to. But one of the really well-known African philosophies is the philosophy of Ubuntu, which is, I paraphrase the sort of official slogan of it, but it's along the lines of I am because you are, yeah, that really is the kind of I think it's a wonderful philosophy and very relevant for our times, and it's, you know, it's much broader than that one line indicates.
But I mean, that's also community. It's not just that, I mean, because our sense of self comes into being when others see us and when others confirm that what we do is seen and understood. So I mean, we build our sense of self upon how others relate to us. But it's not just, I mean, Ubuntu is also about community more than just one-on-one.
Well, I mean, it's very much even more than about one-on-one. It is about codependency. And I think, you know, this year and the pandemic serves as a wonderful example that has demonstrated to so many of us how codependent we are, you know, on people doing the different professions that they do, whether it is the essential workers or the scientists who are working to find a vaccine, or the politicians who can reassure citizens that, or not reassure them, as has been the case often, but hopefully would be able to do that job. And Ubuntu is the emphasis on that in knowledge production, in societal relations. So it's not just the awareness of it, which is quite easy for us. As Sandrine was saying, we can get stuck in ideas and the discourses around how we are codependent. But Ubuntu goes deeper than that in saying that we shape our politics and our societies around this knowledge. And very importantly, also around the I am because you are extends to the animal world and to the non-human natural world. And it's bizarre when you think about it, and I'm reminded of Klaas's opening remarks of how, we've sort of digressed. It almost feels as, both in Europe and elsewhere in the world, that there was a far deeper wisdom at some point, because it is so self-evident that, the ruining of our home, our planet, shapes and means, in essence, the destruction of our lives and our codependency with each other, and the cultural, the things that give us cultural and spiritual meaning, because we are so depending on a kind of harmonious coexistence with each other and with our planet. So I'm glad to bring up the notion of Ubuntu in this context.
So if when you look, I mean, from your position, look at the world and the people you collaborate with and the people you interact with, your relationships, how many people out there are aware of what we're talking about here? I mean, these other ways of looking at things, the connectedness, the interconnectedness, the bigger perspectives and the spirituality and the science. I mean, how many are we? How many are there?
I think that people are increasingly aware, or at least have a nagging feeling that is the direction in which these sort of really toxic problems that are now impacting all of our lives in such drastic ways. I think people feel like there needs to be a shift toward interconnectedness. It's certainly quite a popular terminology in civic discourse at the moment. What I think is not happening near enough, and that people are not discussing or aware of near enough, is a kind of Bildung, and maybe more specifically the fact that interconnectedness relies upon on an individualism of sorts, ironically, and so it's almost like a theater play. Where if you have only one phenomenal actor, the whole play won't be as good as if everybody came and gave their best. And I feel like the discussion isn't really going to that kind of self-development angle, you could say, where interconnectedness relies upon each of us individually developing as best we can, with the acknowledgement, of course, that we come from very different backgrounds, and some people have more access to, whether it's information and knowledge resources, or just to the things that we need in order to survive in life. But that if we can produce a culture which, because culture is shared meaning, you could define culture as shared meaning, and so if we start to produce and encourage a culture which creates a shared meaning that we all have to, so it's still individualist in the sense that we all have to self-develop, we all have to be our best selves, if you like, but in order for the collective good. So in order to create this incredible and riveting theatric play, if you like, So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Sandrine, you hang out with all the world leaders all the time. At the very top level of, the species, humanity, how much awareness is there regarding this?
So what is this? I guess that's what I'm trying to get my head around. Are we calling it Bildung? Are we calling it a greater consciousness? If we're calling it a greater consciousness, I think that everyone is aware, or most people are growingly aware of the fact that there is a huge malaise in society at very different levels. Growing sense of angst, highest number of suicides that we've ever had historically, the fact that we have more young people unemployed. This is the first generation that's going to make less money than any generations prior in the 20th century, and now in the 21st. And so that growing sense of angst and something is wrong has now actually grown even larger through COVID. And I would say that the consciousness that we're seeing and the being able to tap into this new consciousness is that many more people have come to realize that actually what's most essential is not the materialism that we've been talking about. It's not the ego, it's actually the solidarity, it's the collectiveness, it's the fact that we want access to food, water, jobs, healthcare. That actually owning 3 cars,
toilet paper. That was the
you know,
big
owning
thing.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, owning 3 cars is not going to help us if we're in confinement. Having more pants is not, trousers is not going to help us in confinement.
We're just going to wear sweatpants anyway, because nobody's going to watch us below, you know,
exactly.
the waist. Yeah.
Exactly. So I think that we are right now. And so coming to world leaders, I mean, that's everyone, right? I do firmly believe that there is a growing understanding, except those that have decided to fight the system, fight the science, and fight themselves. Because I think that, you know, all those that have decided not to wear masks, not to respect rules, to basically say, I don't care, this doesn't make any sense, and I have the right to do whatever I want, have totally missed the point. But anyway, that's a whole other culture that we need to figure out how to get to. But all the others, a much larger growing part of the population. In fact, surveys across Europe have indicated that most citizens don't want to go back to business as usual, that most citizens understand that we need to live differently, that if we don't do that, we will have more and more crises. So that already is a symbolic aspect that's super important. Coming to leaders, we have a president of the European Commission, and I know, Lena, you've heard me say this, but I keep on saying it.
There are people here who have not heard you say this, so that's okay.
Okay. So the fact of the matter is, you know, here is, and I've just seen one of her tweets, by the way, she's talking about COVID with all the world leaders tonight, and everybody's tired, and she's showing emotion through her tweet. This is a conservative, a card-carrying conservative leader, right? In the United States, she would be propagating hate. She would be trying to push for her own solution. And instead, she talks about the fragility of people. She talks about solidarity. And she continues to talk about moving from wealth to well-being. Unbelievable in her State of the Union address. And she talks about the fragile planet that we have and that we must work together to find solutions, and that the European Green Deal, which very much goes to Klaus's point, is a multidisciplinary approach to how we solve issues, and a systems approach, because we've also worked with her on it, is actually going forward. So what we're seeing is leaders like Ursula von der Leyen. But this morning I was on a panel with the president of Ireland, and he was saying the same thing. He was talking about the fact that we cannot continue to do what we're doing. We have to move towards a well-being economy. We have more and more leaders within Europe who are talking about a well-being economy, who are talking about actually putting in place at the local level a donut economy, who are thinking about environmental, social, and economic indicators together, which talk about prosperity, not growth, more equity, etc. And so I think that there is, you know, they may not say it's Bildung, or they may not say it's well-being, or they may not say it's this or it's that, but what they're all starting to move towards is, don't talk to me about the fact that we actually have the best system possible, that we actually are making people happier, that we actually are getting ourselves out of the mess. What they're all saying is, no, we need a paradigm shift. We need to react, be with each other in a very different way. We have to be more collaborative. We have to understand science and translate it into action. And that for me is a huge shift. And they may all use different words. I really don't care. The fact is we're getting leaders now who are enlightened and who are potentially at what I would call a new renaissance in terms of the way in which they're going to think and they're going to create the future. But the dinosaurs are awakening to this, and hence why I opened up with the Common Agricultural Policy reform and the recovery. Those egomaniacs, those dinosaurs, those incumbents who all have a hell of a lot to lose are going to do everything they possibly can to hold on to power. And so we have to be ahead of the curve. We have to be much smarter. We have to be more strategic, and we have to understand how we can capture people's minds and hearts to bring them on the journey.
Klaas, I want to hear you want to say something, but I also want to ask Minna something. But Klaas, you first. Klaas, your microphone.
Microphone is on. Yeah, I cannot agree more with Sandrine. I as a male, I'm the only male on this panel. That's remarkable.
But we like you. We like you.
What I wanted to say is a little bit complicated in that sense that when we have at university, we have these chats with the coffee machine in the early morning, you know, and then we're discussing all these policies, the Green Deal of Frans Timmermans and the climate change and why it will not work, etc., etc. And then every time the discussion ends in the same way, and that is, okay, that will not work out, but we have a gradual change, and we have studied that. In our enlightenment period, the people who have value orientation of the recent past, all these technology believers, etc., they are in 2/3 of the cases they are male, so they might have a masculine value orientation. We are shifting now. The progressive people are already at a worldview which is opposed to it, and there we have 2/3 females. So that's more feminine. It's less materialist. It's more spiritual. It's more respect for the particular, not only the universal. So the idea at the coffee machine is that at the end of the day, the shift from more masculine value orientations into more feminine, you are talking about Ursula von der Leyen, etc., that will do the job. So just as a support for your statement, we think that what we are seeing now is a natural phenomenon. The whole Me Too movement is not a movement as such. It's a natural phenomenon. It's like a volcano eruption, and nobody can stop it. It has to happen, and it's the shift from the masculine to the feminine society. So that is very hopeful. As I made a second remark on your talk, and that's the fact that when you are looking at the thick book of Jared Diamond called Collapse, it's 1,000 pages, and the summary at the end is more, in my own words, is more or less the following. He is saying that all these civilizations, we are discussing Ubuntu, Ben Vivir, and what have you in the world, who are facing these ecological problems in the past. He studied that over the other 900 pages. These people were aware of the problems that they were facing, but the problem was that the older generation, with their vested interests, withhold the younger generation to solve the problem timely. And that is also what Aristotle is talking to us. He's saying, well, okay, it might be hard to find the middle way in all these problems, the virtuous path. But he is saying 2,500 years ago, look at the evil extremes. These are the vested interests which is withholding society to change. And then the final remark, I think that we have to look at the power of the global economy at this very moment, the global financial system, which is the vested interests which withhold us from making these changes. So the majority already is ready for this change, but these remaining vested interests first has to change. So we are making a plea for the separation of state and church, of course, was a big success in history. Now we are up to the separation of state and economy. That has to be all these enormous lobbies, you know, in Brussels, for example, and in all these cities, that has to stop. And the economy has its own responsibility, and the state has to make its own choices. And that separation then can guarantee that these vested interests no longer influence the changes we have to make.
We're going to have Esli come in with some comments from the chat in a moment. But before that, Mina, you talk about a different kind of power, exousians, I think it's called. Can you say a few words about that, please?
Yeah, sure. So exousia is the ancient Greek word for power. And I have been writing about a notion that I coined, which I call exousians. And it's about many of the things that I've spoken about this evening, but especially the codependence. It's a notion of power that is that relies upon our coexistence in an ecosystem with nature. So exousians came to me as a concept during a time in my life where I felt a really strong need to speak to nature. So not only be out in nature, but I was going through a lot and I had a lot of questions on my mind and I couldn't quite answer them. And one of those things that I was mulling over was the question of power. So as somebody who's been speaking and writing about feminisms and Black liberation and power struggles for over a decade, this question of power has always concerned and bothered me insofar that, you know, we in the circles that I move in, there's a strong criticism of power, but there's very rarely or insufficient amount of reimagination and reinvention of what power could be. And so I was spending all this time observing nature, trying to commune and speak and learn from nature. And this concept, exousians, came to me first through rivers and later through trees. And what I saw was this kind of reciprocity and the way that a river, if a river meets an obstacle, whether it is a man-made dam or weir, or whether it is pollution, all of these many things that create obstacles for rivers, they don't stop. They flow, you know, around, under, above, and that spoke to me about what power could look like. It wasn't aggressive. It was just a kind of a right to exist, and then I looked at the shape of what that looks like as a river leaves its mouth to its source, which is the ocean, and the way that it branches off into tributaries. And that, of course, is a similar pattern that we find in the branches of trees, but also, you know, all across nature. If you take an aerial look at mountains, you see that same dendritic type of pattern. And then also within our bodies and our arteries, our neurons, and, you know, everywhere. Since I've been working on this concept, I just see this pattern everywhere. And that pattern kind of created the grammatical lexicon for exousians in how, you know, you can't, it's like the chicken and egg scenario. You can't tell if the branch comes from the source or the source created the branch. And basically, if we were to model more of our institutions around that, there would be a reciprocity. So the economy would be, you know, almost erotic in a sense of having the quality of needing one another and a non-hierarchical way of creating institutions in which everybody can still contribute. Going back to the theater play, you come with what you can offer, but with the realization that contributes to the flourishing of the whole.
Thank you. Esli, are you there? And do we have some questions from the chat or comments, please?
Yes, yeah, we do. I'm watching a very interesting discussion that is already unfolding, and Sandrine is already partaking, actually. And it was started by a question by Nadia Taranceveski, and if it's okay with her, I would actually like her to read out her own question.
Yes, please.
So that I don't, yeah. Nadia.
Hey guys, actually I did pose two questions and I'd love to go to the second one where I already started a little exchange here with Sandrine. So Klaas, in the very beginning you mentioned that the financial system sort of led us into this type of hyper capitalism that we're now suffering the consequences from. And I sort of deeply believe that as long as we're hypnotized by this myth that money will buy us freedom and happiness and well-being, we will actually not let go of the idea that we need to make more money, and we will not move beyond exploitation and the fixation on, you know, saving the economy, which is a sort of a recurring theme, at least in, you know, in German politics, and as far as I can tell, all across the globe. So for me, the question is always, you know, of course, that's my particular viewpoint. I'm a psychologist and a coach. And so I always look at what is the relationship that we have with things. So for example, in this case, with money, and how can we use that as an entry point into consciousness work that might ultimately lead us into a well-being economy. So I'm interested in your thoughts on this. And also the add-on question that I had was, I do have the experience that more and more people seem to be willing to reconsider and redesign, rethink the financial system, with the exception of those who actually hold all the wealth, right? And then my question was, how do we reach them, right? And Sandrine, you said, well, for example, we need to tax them, which I think is a brilliant idea, but it seems to me that politicians worldwide are very hesitant to taxing the wealthy. So yeah, so those are my questions.
Wonderful. Who would like to
Let's
answer?
go first, because I've been responding, and I'll add to Klaus.
Start from my side. Okay. Yeah. Now the three things. In the first place, you should notice that in my view, the current financial system is the exaggeration of our current spirit of the times, of our current worldview. It's materialist, it's egocentric, it's more, again, individual, and in these two value orientation brings about the idea that greed is good, and so it's completely obsessive, and it had disappeared from the whole of human dignity, actually. So that's one. A second thing is that I believe, I'm convinced even, and that I'm interested what Sandrine thinks about it. When we would change the financial system in Europe, and we are working on that very intensely, we're writing papers and making models, etc. We have a discussion which is 2,500 years old. Aristotle already said that money is a matter of fact. It's the prerogative of the community. The community is making money, defining money according to their value orientation. So the price has something to do with the value of things in our perception. That is the starting point, and that's now completely lost. For well, I can talk for hours on the subject. I will try to be compact on the subject. The idea is that in the 90s of the last century, we had these privatizations. We in our office had to make all sorts of cost-benefit analysis for the Dutch government to privatize the whole world, railways, energy production, etc. And also the whole liberalization of banks was occurring. 10 years later, we had the financial crisis, and the reason is that banks were going to make their own money, giving you a mortgage for your house. They were just printing the money. The price of all the houses is going up as a consequence. The money is going into society. People think economy is doing well. Let's pay more for the houses. Housing prices, other assets, land, etc., going up and up and up. It's a positive feedback loop, and you have the crisis of 2008. Since then, nothing has changed. What you are facing now in Europe with the Corona aid, for example, is that we are having 750 billion aid for these euro bonds, which is a collective debt in European Union. And they are telling us that our children or my grandchildren has to pay back the coming 40 years that amount of money which we have lended from the financial markets. But these financial markets, read banks mainly, just printed the money themselves. We had the Treaty of Maastricht in 1992. Then it was decided in Europe that it was forbidden for governments to print money, against Aristotle. And since then, only private banks are printing the money. I could show you the graphs over here on my desk, which you can see how in the European Union the amount of money by printing money by banks exploded. With what Draghi did was 2,500 billion euros pumping into the system in the financial markets. But the core of the whole debate is that when we would go back to Maastricht, change that arrangement over there, that treaty, and would say, listening to Aristotle and many other heads of state, Abraham Lincoln, Ricardo, great economists, Maynard Keynes, all these people were saying money is a matter of the community. Then we would have a European bank in which you can steal your money. And when there is a crisis, it remains your money. We do not need to save banks for hundreds of millions of billions of euros. And second, the government, the community is printing the money. And in a small country like the Netherlands, that would mean that we would have 30 to 50 billion euros more to spend every year. And we are debating at this very night in Parliament the salary of people in the healthcare system, and we don't have the money to pay them, we are saying, but we are missing every year 50 billion euros due to an erroneous, flawed financial system. Yeah. And last statement, and I will finalize, otherwise I can talk for hours on the subject. When we would have the courage to change that in Europe, we would have an enormous amount of money, for you have to produce money in a growing economy. And the only question is, who is making that money? If we, the people, the European government, the ECB, would print that money, not banks anymore, bring it into circulation, then the whole Corona aid, no need to pay it back by your grandchildren the coming 40 years, but just it's there, it's without debt, and the only thing you have to look at is the level of inflation. So we are in a golden cage, the door is open, the only thing is we have to flew out, and it would give a new spirit, a new elan to Europe, and we could, all this enormous trouble in Europe at this moment, and this depression and what have you, could be changed by realizing the fact that we have an erroneous system which we could change easily, and if we were doing so, many things would have been solved and it would give a new spirit in Europe.
And Klaas, maybe to just quickly go in there, because I think that's exactly the point, right? In all of the discussions that you had so far, it's not like we don't know how to do things better, but somehow it's just not happening on a big enough level. And I'm wondering, what is the stuckness? Like, where are we attached to old things that keep us from moving into that new normal that we could actually now have, because the knowledge is there, the capacity is there, it's all there.
Yeah, so maybe I can build, sorry, Klaus, go ahead, and then I'll build on that, because I really think you've just hit the nail on the head, Nadja. Maybe just to add then, I mean, I think that, and this is coming back to Mina's point as well, I mean, there are different levels. Klaus has now really come into the monetary system, but it's our relationship with money as well. I mean, there is a perverse relationship with money. The fact that money will buy us more, that money actually makes us who we are, all of that, the psychoanalysis of who we are linked to what we're worth from a monetary perspective rather than from an emotional, physical, or other perspective. So I think that is part of the problem, is the way in which we place way too much value on the dollar sign or on the euro sign, but then to come to what are those short-term levers that will enable the long-term systems change, and that's where we're starting to see a shift. Although, let's be very clear, I mean, already in 1964, I think, was the Robert Kennedy speech in Florida, where he, or no, actually, sorry, it was 1968. And where he said, we place a value on everything that has no meaning and do not place a value on what does. And that is the problem, is that money has placed a value on everything that actually doesn't have real meaning for people's lives and livelihoods, but somehow they've been tricked into thinking that it does. Yeah. So then how do we use the current mechanisms to totally shift? Because I don't believe we're going to get 100% systems change in 10 years, which, by the way, is the decade of action that we need. So how do we get smart? One is, right now, again, if you look at the COVID crisis, what's happened? It's all those companies that actually have put in place environmental, social, and governance criteria. It's not enough. but it's a start. All of a sudden placing a value on what matters, that are done better in funds and indexes. So that comes to your next point, which you made in the chat, which is how do we get people to shift, right? Well, the wealthy, if they realize that investing in fossil energy is no longer the right investment, but they should be investing in renewables, that's starting to finance change. It's not changing finance, but it's financing change. Then you start to look at that value shift. And you see that actually those companies are starting, and we've already got many tales of this, are starting to feel like they're doing the right thing. People who are working within those companies are starting to feel like they're in a company that's doing the right thing. More youth want to work in a company that's doing the right thing. And all of a sudden, the value system has shifted in terms of the psychological thinking of what is important in terms of placing a value. Then you take the whole sustainable finance work that Klaus was referring to and some of the work that they're doing, but also the work that I sit on the sustainable finance platform, for example, at the European level. We are putting in place an entire taxonomy and criteria system that is placing a value on green, not brown. We are starting to place an entire system on what is social value, not what is not social value. So how do we treat people right? What are the type of criteria that investment communities have to have? And then the last point is we're seeing banks that are stepping up to the plate, that are starting to communicate better. You know, you look at Triodos, which is one of our members, Peter Blom, was a member of the Club of Rome, but the work that Triodos and other ethical banks who are actually also really developing a totally different value-based system in the way in which they do banking. It's not a 100% shift, but those levers are starting to then get triggers into society, consumers who are starting to think, wow, this is a better investment than that was. And this makes more sense. And actually, my money's going to the right thing. And then we need to create the bigger shift, which, okay, I shouldn't be dependent on money in the first place, and we should have the broader value system. But I think it's a start. And I think we need to think about those short-term levers as potential long-term levers for change.
So, Klaus, a quick comment, please.
Yeah, there's my view. I think we don't have the time to do that. We waited that for that moment last 50 years since the Limits to Growth Club of Rome. Only a few things have happened. I think that the change in the monetary system in Europe, now we have all these troubles with the ECB anyhow. They are not going to fix the problems they have at this moment. So the transfer union is a big issue. The change I'm proposing on behalf of many other scientists is actually very simple, and that will keep out the driver of the system. Last sentence, the current financial system is the big driver behind climate change, behind land acquisition in Africa, for example. I often used to say in presentations, the past centuries we conquered Africa. Nowadays we are buying the country over there. So there is a huge driver on all these sustainable practices going on from the current financial system. We are arriving the point in the Netherlands that the average Dutchman has not seen an increase in its wealth or in income the last 30, 40 years. Only shareholders have. Shareholders has withheld Mr. Unilever, Paul Polman, to make his palm oil things in Indonesia sustainable. The shareholder is just blocking that. So that these are the vested interests Jared Diamond is talking about. So changing that system is very simple, and it will change the whole condition of sustainability as a whole, I think.
Mina, do you have a
yeah, I have a quick comment. I think Nadia's question about, you know, how do we actually use the knowledge that we already have? Like, how can that be transformative and create the shifts that we desperately need? And I mean, of course, there's no simple answer to that. But one thing that hasn't been mentioned yet, and I think is really important, is about, it has to do with power again, and how we need a shift. We need people to understand that they have power once again. The societies we live in, where power has become so tied to mega corporations and to politics and things like that, has left a generation or generations even of people who don't perceive themselves as having agency in order to change society. And it's really essential, if we are going to transform the knowledge we have into action, is that people understand that they have the power to change things. Because what then happens is that as people, as the masses start to engage in conversations about shifting power, they will start to seek out the knowledge, to seek out the information, and not only the stuff that's being created contemporarily, but also they will start to return to many of the ideas that I think his name is Jens has been mentioning in the chat, like some really great ideas, and obviously there's many more. So I guess I really strongly believe in the power of people, and I think that one way that can be like practically encouraged is through dialogue groups. So people coming together, whether it is to debate and discuss politics or social relations or climate change, whatever it might be, we have to get people talking again and realizing that when they come together and convene in this way, they can actually then lobby to their politicians. They can create grassroots organizations. And it's hard work. It's a process. It's not easy, but it's really the thing that is missing at the moment still. We still have people who feel like they need authorities to tell them what to do and to give them permission almost to facilitate their own Bildung. And I think in the 21st century, the citizen has to claim ownership of that at a greater extent.
Excellent, thank you. We're about to conclude. So I would like to ask our three guests here. The big question that we asked was, what kind of Bildung do we need to save the planet? And we got two more minutes before we go to the Zoom bar. Those of you who watch us on Facebook will say goodbye to you in 2 minutes, but the rest of us on Zoom we'll hang out for a while and have a more informal discussion. Maybe there's also some a question or two from the chat we would like to pick up on. But please, Sandrine, Mina, and Klaas, what kind of Bildung do we need to save the planet after this discussion, or in general?
I would just say we need a Bildung that focuses on our personal development for the collective good. So we need a Bildung that shifts us from self-interest to collective interest.
Klaas?
For me, Bildung is an education which develops all the faculties, all the abilities we as humans have, and that trains then our human dignity and makes us able to be more ethical, to develop the consciousness of what's going on around in ourselves, in our neighborhood, in our company, and in our country and in the world. And when that consciousness is trained to the young people, I think it will work out.
Sandrine, you get the last word.
Well, it's hard with the incredible words that have been pronounced by the other two speakers, but I would maybe just add, very much building on what Mina indicated, was again this really deep feeling that we need to move from ego to eco, and that eco brings in a lot of what both Klaus and Mina have indicated, which is an ecosystem is one that works in symbiosis. It is a system that tries to respect, understand, build, add value to, complement a series of other actors, whether they be natural actors within a natural ecosystem or whether they be a human ecosystem. And I think that constant osmosis and exchange of whether it be emotion, physical or knowledge base is what really could be, I guess, the vision of the Bildung that we need. But I would add that these conversations are fundamental because they talk about the depth and the difficulty of the way in which we look at the human spirit today and the way in which we function in this world. But we also need to be pragmatic, and we need to figure out what are the tools that are going to get us to where we need to go very quickly. And so I would call upon all of us to definitely continue to have these exchanges, but then unpack what kind of tools could we collectively work on together in order to ensure change. Because as Klaus rightly said, I mean, yes, the Club of Rome has been talking about this for the last 50 years, but I would say, Klaus, the big difference with the last 50 years is that now we basically have 10 years to get it right. We should have gotten it right 50 years ago, but everybody was complacent. And you know as well as I, we were called the doomsday theorists, and everybody thought that the Club of Rome was wrong in terms of the modeling, which is not correct, but also was wrong in terms of thinking that actually technology would not save us or humanity would not save us. Well, now we're against the wall. And so we basically can either demonstrate that the Anthropocene is the most incredible period in history that will demonstrate that the human species is not just intelligent, which is what actually Jane Goodall indicates, or the most intelligent species, but the wisest, the smartest, the one that has understood that we need to tap into all of our capacities in order to really get this right. And that goes, let's get away from the ego into the eco, and let's hope it works.
Thank you all for your wise words, also the wise last words. I would like to invite everybody who has been watching to turn on their camera and bring out, if you have more in your glasses. I think we deserve a toast to Bildung, to ourselves, to the future, to the solutions that we can create. And I'm so happy that you all joined us. So cheers and thank you for a pleasant evening.
Cheers. Here's to Bildung.
Cheers to Bildung.